You're standing in the bustling streets of ancient Rome, marveling at the architectural wonders and military triumphs that built an empire spanning 3 continents. But beneath the gleaming marble and celebrated conquests lies a darkness so profound that even acknowledging it forces us to confront the horrifying reality of what human beings are capable of inflicting upon one another. What you're about to discover comes from legal documents, historical accounts, and archaeological evidence that reveals how the Roman Empire, for over 1,000 years, systematically brutalized millions of women through practices so barbaric that documenting them becomes an exercise in understanding humanity's capacity for institutionalized cruelty. The horrors we'll explore weren't isolated incidents committed by rogue individuals. They were legal, socially accepted, and economically driven policies that reduced human beings to property with less legal protection than livestock. These weren't cultural misunderstandings or primitive ignorance. They were calculated systems of exploitation that generated enormous wealth for Roman citizens while destroying countless lives in the process. Before we continue, if you're interested in the hidden realities of ancient history, consider subscribing. It's remarkable that we can examine these forgotten stories together from different parts of the world, connected by our shared responsibility to understand the past, no matter how disturbing it proves to be. The most psychologically devastating aspect of female slavery in ancient Rome began with the systematic targeting of children. Young girls were specifically purchased for what Romans called vernae breeding programs, where children born in slavery were considered more valuable than those captured in war because they could be molded from birth into perfect servants. The case of Claudia Fortunata provides a chilling window into this process. Born to enslaved parents on a villa outside Rome, she never knew freedom or had any concept that alternatives to her existence were possible. From the moment she could walk, every aspect of her development was controlled by her master's economic interests. Roman slave owners had developed sophisticated techniques for psychological conditioning that would impress modern behavioral scientists. Children like Claudia were given small rewards for compliance and harsh punishments for any sign of independent thinking. They were taught that their worth as human beings depended entirely on their ability to anticipate and fulfill their owner's desires. The training process was terrifyingly systematic. Young enslaved girls learned domestic skills alongside techniques designed to make them sexually appealing to their masters and guests. They studied music, dance, and conversation, but every skill served a single horrific purpose: maximizing their value as human commodities. By age 10, these children understood that their bodies belonged to someone else, and that resistance would result in punishments designed not just to cause pain, but to serve as warnings to other enslaved children. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as it was cruel, creating adults who had never experienced agency over their own lives. When girls like Claudia reached puberty, the final phase of their commodification began. Roman law explicitly stated that female slaves had no right to refuse sexual advances from their owners, guests, or anyone their master designated. This wasn't considered rape under Roman legal frameworks because slaves were property, and property couldn't be raped. The systematic sexual exploitation of enslaved women operated on a scale that dwarfs most historical atrocities. Wealthy Romans maintained harems of enslaved women for personal use and to entertain business associates. These weren't hidden practices conducted in shame, but open displays of wealth and power that enhanced a man's social status. The breeding programs reveal the complete moral bankruptcy of Roman society. Female slaves were forced to reproduce under conditions that can only be described as human livestock management. Masters selected which women would bear children based on physical characteristics they wanted to perpetuate, with no regard for the women's consent or well-being. Pregnancy offered no respite from sexual exploitation. Enslaved women were expected to continue servicing their masters throughout pregnancy, and those who became less attractive due to physical changes faced sale to brothels or gladiator schools, where conditions were even more brutal. The children born from these forced pregnancies belonged entirely to the master, who could sell them, kill them, or raise them for specific purposes within the household. Mothers were forbidden from forming emotional bonds with their offspring, who were considered economic assets rather than human beings deserving of love and protection. Roman law codified these practices with chilling precision. The Digest of Justinian, a comprehensive legal text, explicitly outlined the rights of masters over their female slaves' bodies. These weren't moral guidelines or cultural suggestions, but legally enforceable regulations that gave owners absolute power over every aspect of their slaves' existence. The economic network supporting female slavery extended throughout the Roman Empire, creating an international trade in human misery that generated more wealth than most legitimate industries. Ships regularly transported cargoes of enslaved women between Roman territories, with specialized dealers maintaining inventories of human beings the way merchants stocked grain or pottery. The profits from this trade funded many of the architectural marvels we associate with Roman civilization. The Colosseum, the aqueducts, the roads that connected the empire were all built with wealth extracted from enslaved labor, including the systematic sexual exploitation of countless women whose names have been erased from history. The documentation of these practices exists in disturbing detail because Romans saw nothing shameful in their actions. Legal contracts for the purchase of sex slaves, household accounts listing the costs of maintaining enslaved women, and court cases involving disputes over slave ownership all survive in archives, providing undeniable evidence of systematic exploitation that operated for centuries. Perhaps most chilling is how thoroughly this system had corrupted Roman moral sensibilities. Free Roman women, despite their own limited rights, often participated in the abuse of enslaved women, seeing their elevated status as dependent on maintaining the hierarchy that brutalized others. The normalization of sexual violence against enslaved women created a culture where rape was viewed as a property crime rather than a violation of human dignity. Masters who sexually assaulted their female slaves faced no legal consequences because they were simply using their own property. The concept of consent was meaningless in a legal system that didn't recognize slaves as capable of giving or withholding permission for anything. This systematic dehumanization extended to every aspect of daily life, creating a state of complete subjugation that reduced human beings to animated tools designed for their owners' profit and pleasure. The physical torture methods employed against female slaves reveal the calculated sadism underlying Roman civilization. Women who showed any signs of resistance faced punishments designed not merely to inflict pain, but to destroy their capacity for future defiance, while serving as terrifying examples to other enslaved women. The fustuarium was a particularly brutal technique where rebellious female slaves were beaten with clubs and rods by groups of male slaves who were forced to participate in the torture of their fellow victims. This method served multiple psychological purposes, turning enslaved people against each other while demonstrating the absolute power masters held over life and death. Branding was universally practiced throughout the Roman Empire, with female slaves marked using red-hot iron instruments that seared ownership symbols directly into their flesh. These brands were strategically placed on faces, breasts, and other visible areas to ensure permanent identification and psychological humiliation. The pain was excruciating, but the lasting disfigurement served as a constant reminder of their status as property. The crucifixion of female slaves was legal and common, particularly for those who attempted escape or showed defiance toward their masters. Unlike the quick execution methods reserved for Roman citizens, enslaved women faced prolonged agony designed to maximize suffering while providing entertainment for their owners and neighbors. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii reveals the horrifying living conditions endured by female slaves in Roman households. Excavations have uncovered cramped basement cells where women were chained during non-working hours, with iron shackles still attached to skeletal remains, that tell stories of lives spent in constant physical restraint. The thermal baths that symbolized Roman luxury were sites of systematic sexual abuse for enslaved women who worked there. These facilities operated as semi-official brothels, where female slaves were expected to provide sexual services to male patrons as part of their regular duties, generating additional income for bathhouse owners. Roman dinner parties, celebrated in literature as pinnacles of civilized entertainment, routinely featured the sexual abuse of enslaved women as after-dinner entertainment. Female slaves were forced to perform sexual acts in front of guests, participate in orgies, or submit to rape while patrician families enjoyed their meals and discussed philosophy. The gladiatorial games that Romans celebrated as displays of courage and skill included systematic torture of female slaves as preliminary entertainment. Women were forced to fight each other to the death, thrown to wild animals while naked and defenseless, or subjected to public sexual assault before crowds of cheering spectators. Medical experimentation on female slaves was not only legal, but encouraged as a means of advancing Roman knowledge of anatomy and surgical techniques. Enslaved women served as test subjects for procedures that were too dangerous to attempt on free citizens, with their pain and death considered acceptable costs for medical progress. The salt mines that powered Roman industry became death sentences for female slaves who were worked literally to death in conditions so brutal that survival beyond a few months was virtually impossible. Women labored in underground tunnels where toxic fumes, cave-ins, and exhaustion killed them by the thousands while generating enormous profits for mine owners. Transportation of female slaves throughout the empire involved conditions that make modern human trafficking seem humane by comparison. Women were chained together in ship holds for weeks without adequate food, water, or sanitation, with dead bodies left among the living until reaching port destinations where survivors could be sold. The Roman military's treatment of captured women reveals the institutional nature of sexual violence within the empire's expansion. Female civilians taken during conquests were systematically raped by entire legions as a reward for victory, then sold into slavery to finance future military campaigns. Household management manuals written by prominent Romans provided detailed instructions for controlling female slaves through starvation, sleep deprivation, and strategic violence. These texts treated human suffering as a technical problem requiring systematic solutions, with torture methods discussed as casually as recipes for bread. The religious festivals that Romans celebrated as expressions of piety regularly featured the ritual sacrifice of female slaves to various deities. Women were burned alive, thrown from cliffs, or buried alive while crowds gathered to witness these offerings that supposedly ensured divine favor for the community. Roman law schools used cases involving the torture and murder of female slaves as teaching tools for aspiring lawyers and judges. Students learned to argue legal points while examining real evidence of systematic brutality, normalizing violence against enslaved women as part of professional education. The postal system that connected the Roman Empire relied heavily on female slaves who were worked to death carrying messages across dangerous terrain. These women faced assault, starvation, and death from exposure while maintaining communication networks that kept the empire functioning. Wealthy Roman women participated directly in the torture of their female slaves, using specialized instruments designed to maximize pain while avoiding permanent damage that might reduce their property's economic value. Mistresses competed with each other to devise the most creative punishments for minor infractions. The systematic disposal of female slaves who became too old, injured, or sick to work reveals the complete commodification of human life within Roman society. Women were abandoned in remote locations to die of exposure, thrown into sewers while still alive, or killed outright when their maintenance costs exceeded their economic value. Urban workshops throughout the empire operated as industrial-scale sites of exploitation, where female slaves worked 18-hour days producing textiles, pottery, and metalwork under conditions designed to extract maximum productivity before their inevitable deaths from exhaustion and abuse. The legal testimony procedures for enslaved women required torture as a prerequisite for accepting their statements in court. Female slaves were stretched on racks, whipped with barbed instruments, and subjected to burns before being allowed to speak, with many dying during these interrogations that served no purpose beyond satisfying sadistic legal requirements. The systematic brutalization of female slaves in ancient Rome challenges every comfortable assumption we hold about the foundations of Western civilization. These weren't the actions of a primitive society struggling with moral development. They were the calculated policies of the most sophisticated legal, military, and administrative system the ancient world had ever seen. The evidence sits in archives across Europe, meticulously documented by Romans who saw nothing shameful in reducing human beings to commercial transactions. Legal contracts for the purchase of women, household accounts detailing torture expenses, and court records describing systematic abuse all survive as testimony to an empire built on unimaginable suffering. Understanding this history isn't about condemning modern Italy or dismissing Roman achievements in law, engineering, and governance. It's about recognizing how easily entire civilizations can become complicit in systematic dehumanization when it serves economic and social interests. The same intellectual frameworks that gave us Roman jurisprudence also provided legal justification for treating women as livestock. The voices of these enslaved women have been largely erased by history, but their stories demand acknowledgement as reminders that humanity's greatest monuments often rest on foundations of institutionalized cruelty. Every marble column and engineering marvel we admire today was built with wealth extracted from their stolen lives, their destroyed families, and their systematic torture. These forgotten victims deserve more than our horror. They deserve our commitment to ensuring that such systematic dehumanization never again operates with legal protection and social approval.